Hi, my name's Mike. I'm one of the workshop assistants at the University of Pittsburgh's Center for Creativity. In this video, I'm going to test 3 different at-home air-dry clay recipes. After finding a lot of different recipes online, I decided to go with 3 that were the most dissimilar. All 3 clays use cornstarch as their primary ingredient, but these recipes all use different ingredients as the binder. For each of these recipes, you're likely to have all of the ingredients at home. I'll test the ease of use, the ability to sculpt with the clay, strength of the clay, and the water resistance of the clay. So let's get started. For recipe number 1, we'll start with 2 tablespoons of cornstarch, 4 tablespoons of glue, 2 teaspoons of canola oil, and 2 teaspoons of lemon juice. Now stir all together. Then we're going to add to the microwave for 30 seconds. Stir it a little bit. And then we're going to microwave it again for 30 seconds. And then the recipe says that you will add cornstarch until it's no longer sticky. It didn't specify how much to add, but as you see, I'm adding quite a few heaping teaspoons. So when I was actually able to start handling it, that's when I moved it to my cutting board and started trying to knead it. But this also resulted in needing to add several more teaspoons. It was still a little tacky at this point, but I was overworking with it and added more cornstarch as I started sculpting with it. And that's it for clay number 1. For clay number 2, we start with 1/4 cup baking soda, 2 tablespoons cornstarch, and 3 tablespoons water. Now on medium heat, we're going to stir everything together. It's going to loosen up a bit, and then you're going to continue stirring until it starts to re-thicken. This only took about 3 minutes for me. And then I transferred it to my kneading surface, and this recipe just says knead until no longer sticky, which this one was pretty easy and didn't take long. And that's clay number 2. For clay 3, 2 tablespoons of cornstarch, 1/4 cup salt, and 1/4 cup boiling water. This recipe said to mix it all together and then knead on wax paper, but it was not thickening after a couple minutes, so similar to number 2, I gave it 30 seconds of microwaving and then stirred it, and then another 30 seconds, and I got a pretty thick consistency. So I transferred it to my wax paper, and even though it didn't call for it, I added some cornstarch to help make it less tacky. And the wax paper really was not working for me, so I got rid of that too. So I just kept on adding cornstarch until I felt we were at a decent consistency and that I was able to work with it better without it being tacky and sticking to my fingers. And that's clay number 3. I didn't want to make something too complex to test the clay with, so I made the little spirits that resided in the trees in the animated film Princess Mononoke, and I also made some beads. So even with the addition of some more cornstarch, this clay still stayed a little hard to work with. So you'll see with the beads that there was some problems trying to make the holes because it kept on stretching in ways that I didn't intend it to. I then lightly covered everything so this way it wouldn't dry out too fast and crack, and then stored the extra clay. Clay 2 had the opposite problem of clay 1 in that it was too dry, so I had to add some water as I worked with it. This clay wasn't too bad. There was nothing I particularly disliked about it, and it held shapes pretty well whenever I indented it and made the beads. Clay number 3 had an interesting gummy texture and was one of my favorites to work with because it held more rigid shapes, so if you were making something complex, this would probably be the clay you wanted to use. I did also try combining all 3 clays, but it ended up with an unworkable texture. After letting everything dry for 48 hours, I began to run a couple different tests on the clay. The first test was durability. I was surprised at how well this one held up. It didn't sand well, but it was very hard to scratch, and even when I took a hammer to it, it really didn't shatter like I expected it to. Clay number 2 was a lot like plaster. It was really easy to sand down with 100 grit sandpaper, and I actually broke off the leg of one of them. And while I couldn't just break this with my hands, and scratching it didn't do too much, whenever I took a hammer to it, it did shatter into a lot more pieces. Clay number 3 did stay a lot softer than the other two, and it didn't sand well, and when trying to sand it, I did break the head off of this one. You can't see it well in the video, but I was able to scratch this one just a bit with my finger, but I still wasn't able to crush it. But like test number 2, it did just shatter into a whole bunch of pieces. I also put a bead from each of them in some water for about 20 minutes to see how well they held up. Clay number 1 was once again really surprising to me. While it was tacky and scratched more easily, it didn't just break. On the other hand, clay number 2 and number 3 just disintegrated as soon as I applied any pressure to them. After this test, I did try mixing some of clay 1 with some acrylic paint to see how it would work, and you'll see that result a bit later. I put 2 coats of gesso on each of them to prime them, and this was a fairly straightforward process, so I won't show you the whole thing, but there was some difficulty with clay number 3, and if it dried before I put the second layer on, then it would just wipe away on some of the spots. So I did end up having to add a thick coat to get it to stay on. I then added a coat of white paint, and then black paint to the eyes to finish everything off. Despite my gesso being a bit lumpy, I think everything turned out pretty well, and when I seal them, hopefully that gets rid of some of the lumps. I used glow-in-the-dark spray, but that part's optional. You can use any sort of spray finish or varnish that you have. I wanted a matte finish, so I used the spray paint for everything. I didn't want to paint the beads, so I left them normal and just put the spray finish on them, and hopefully that makes them a bit water resistant. The spray finish really did help even everything out with the tree spirits. And I took them into a dark room so you could see the effects of the glow-in-the-dark spray paint. These clays will probably not hold up to the strength of a plastic-based clay like Sculpey that you either air dry or oven bake. If you're playing around with a sculpture, then these clays would work great as a cheap alternative. I don't know if the minerals in the pink salt affect the results of that clay. It's possible that if you're using regular table salt, the results will be different. For ease of use, it really depends on what you're looking for in a clay. I would say that clay number 1 was not very easy because it stayed tacky, but clay number 2 and number 3 were both pretty easy to use. For strength, clay number 1 held up the best. Although there were cracks in some of the pieces, at no point did I feel like it was going to break while I was painting or working with it. If you are looking for something to make a complex model, I would stick with clay number 3. For painting, it really depends on what surface you want, but clay number 1 and number 2 were probably about the same. If you're looking for a clay that you don't have to put many layers of paint on, I would go with clay number 2 because it's easy to sand down. Clay number 1 was the most waterproof, but I'm not sure if I would have stuck it in water longer if it would have disintegrated like 2 and 3. But you don't have to be afraid about getting it a little wet. For my personal use, I would probably stick with clay number 1 or 3 because the plaster-like feel of clay number 2 was just very fragile, and I don't feel the need to have a perfectly smooth surface when I start painting, so it doesn't really benefit me. Clay number 1 is probably my favorite for its durability, even though it's a little hard to use. I don't make very many complex sculptures, so the tackiness doesn't bother me that much. Overall, I would say I was surprised that all 3 clays turned out fairly usable. I wasn't sure if I would find something that would be stronger than a kid's Play-Doh. And I think all 3 of these recipes held up fairly well. If you have any other questions, feel free to email us at creative.pitt.edu, and you can find all of our social media links down in the description. Thank you for watching, and have a nice day.